9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to Deep State Radio. I'm David Rothkopf, and we're here again to talk about what's going on in the world and to do so with some of the smartest experts there are, our friends, starting with Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center, who is at a secret location somewhere in the American West. How are you, Rosa?
I'm great, David. I like being in secret locations in the American West. It's awesome.
Well, we've always counted on you for that. She's the designated survivor here at Deep State Radio. If something goes wrong with the world, Rosa will be out someplace where they can't get her. And of course, Ed Luce of the Financial Times, right at ground zero of every problem in the world. How are you doing, Ed?
I'm doing wonderfully. Thank you, David.
Well, that's great. And our old friend, Max Boot of the Council on Foreign Relations. How are you this Wednesday in the summer, Max?
Hanging in there, despite the travails of the world.
Well, there are plenty of travails, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'd like to sort of pull back our focus because typically there's some kind of crazy chaos going on in the world. And so we end up talking about one story in particular, whatever the story of the day is. And what I'd like to do is get a little bit of perspective. We're now approaching 6 weeks of Trump 2.0. And whereas, the onset of fascism in the United States is the kind of thing you could talk about every week, and we do on almost all of our podcasts, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the United States is managing its relations with the world at large. And I thought we should do that with Max joining us. And I know you've given all this a lot of thought, Max, but if you could frame what you think, just if somebody says to you, what do you think Trump foreign policy this time around is? Like, what's defining it? How would you characterize it? Where would you start?
It's almost impossible to define because Trump is so erratic. I was just noticing I was researching something and noticing that in early May, Trump fired Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, and one of the reasons why Waltz was fired, evidently, not the only one, but one of the reasons was apparently because Waltz was seen in the White House as somebody who was too eager to cooperate with Israel in attacking the Iranian nuclear program. So in early May, evidently this was a negative for Trump, and yet, less than 2 months later, Trump went and attacked the Iranian nuclear program. So very hard to characterize beyond saying that the Trump foreign policy is whatever Trump thinks it is that day, and he'll probably think of something different tomorrow. And of course, another example that is, which I'm sure Ed is following more closely than I am, is the ups and downs of Trump's tariffs policy, which almost crashed the markets in early April, then led to a freeze of several months. Now Trump is going back in the direction of tariffs, but he's delayed them from early July to August 1st, and who knows if the August 1st deadline will hold. I just think that U.S. foreign policy right now is very chaotic, very unpredictable, and I think that causes a lot of consternation for our friends and allies around the world. You see it also again in the case of Ukraine, where 1 week the Trump administration is pausing aid to Ukraine, and the next week restarting it, which they've now done 2 or 3 times. So what does all of that mean? Damned if I know. I mean, I guess the best you can say for the Trump administration is that some of the worst case scenarios have not yet come to pass. I mean, John Bolton was warning that Trump would withdraw from NATO, and so far that hasn't happened. And Trump seems to be mollified by NATO's pledge to increase defense spending, even though a lot of that is smoke and mirrors. He hasn't entirely abandoned Ukraine, as I feared that he might do at this point. So it's, I guess, the best case is that it's not as bad as it could have been, but it's still pretty bad.
So Ed, Max's opinion is chaos, but not as bad as it could have been. What's your take on Trump foreign policy 2.0?
Yeah, I mean, I'd underline the chaos, which I think is pretty bad. But I mean, Max is right; he hasn't pulled out of NATO, etc. But if you are the rest of the world, forget China and forget America. If you want to continue interacting with these two countries, both of which practice different forms of coercive diplomacy. Trump a much, much more random and inconsistent form, but China is definitely a coercive diplomatic power. Let's not, underplay that. Then you are, I used to say, I borrowed a phrase that with Trump you bring fruits to the volcano, but you're really bringing fruits to two volcanoes in the hope neither erupt, and all the while looking for ways to carve out your autonomy. And this, in one form or another, with one or two exceptions, like Russia, which are trying to increase their dependence on China to sustain its ability to fight the war in Ukraine. This is what everybody is trying to do now. They're trying to insure themselves against either superpowers and both superpowers' coercive diplomacy. And that's, that's bringing in a multipolar world in a way that, a few years ago, I would not have looked forward to multipolarism. But compared to the bipolarity we've got on offer, it's actually starting to look like quite a good deal. Is get autonomy from these bullies. And whatever, Trump's ultimate decision is on tariffs, I mean, I don't believe that will come on August the 1st, by the way. He said in early April that he wanted 90 deals within 90 days. Well, 90 days have elapsed and he's got quotation marks 3 deals, none of which are actual deals. Maybe the Vietnam one is a deal, but the UK one is a framework, sort of agree to agree. We'll fill in the details later. And the China one is a truce between equals. But, even if he does get 90 deals by August the 1st, the people on the other side of those deals, presumably South Korea and the EU and Canada and others, will not believe for a second that they have any durability and will be looking to, and already are, create longer-term arrangements with other trading partners that can be upheld and where there is some sanctity left in the contract bilaterally. Nobody believes there's any sanctity left with contracts, trade or otherwise, with the Trump administration, with the United States. That, to me, is the sort of real effect. And that's, to use a cliche, tectonic in 6 months. That's a really significant shift in the way the world thinks of itself and thinks of the superpowers. With
the tectonics and the volcanoes, there's a whole sort of theme there working, Ed, which I admire when there's that kind of coherence, at least in our analysis. Rosa, what's your take on Trump foreign policy 2.0?
Well, I'm only 150 miles or so from the famous Yellowstone Caldera, which, as we all know, could erupt really at any time and is overdue, destroying most of the Western Hemisphere when it does erupt. So I think the metaphors are totally appropriate. Trump is kind of like the Yellowstone Caldera.
Rosa, always looking on the bright side.
Always looking on the bright side. No, it's. I mean, go back to basics, right? Go back to sort of political theory 101 and international law 101, sort of social contract theory. The one thing that humans as individuals and humans in societies and states want above all is some degree of predictability and stability. And literally on the first day of international law classes, one of the concepts that one tends to teach is the Latin phrase pacta sunt servanda, which essentially means agreements should be kept. Because if you can't count on states to keep their promises at all, then everything falls apart, and you're in the world of Thomas Hobbes rather than the world of John Locke, where states like people are nasty, brutish, and short-lived. maybe short too, who knows. That on the one hand, and I always have this discussion, of course, every international law student says, well, yeah, but states don't always keep their promises, and more powerful states do stuff to less powerful states. And that, of course, is totally true. But the moments of total breakdown that you get, like the world wars, are the moments when you stop being able to rely on states to really keep agreements at all. And most of the rest of the time, in what we consider normal times in international relations, states, this was a famous phrase by the late Columbia law professor Lou Henkin, said something, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but almost all states abide by almost all their international obligations almost all the time. And this is true, including the powerful states, including when it's inconvenient to them, that by and large, whether it's the US, China, Russia, even the most powerful states, if an international court rules against them, they may sulk a little bit and complain, but they'll comply. If the World Trade Organization, if they get some kind of a negative decision, they'll sulk a little bit, but they'll basically comply. If they enter into a treaty arrangement, they have an alliance, they may sulk a little bit if there's something inconvenient to them, but they will basically do it almost all the time. And there's some degree of unpredictability. They won't do it all the time, but there is enough stability and enough predictability that ordinary states minding their own business can kind of go about their business without having to be terrified all the time that, a superpower is going to do something completely wacky that is totally inconsistent with everything they've ever said they would do in the past. And we've now entered into one of those extremely dangerous eras where the behavior of the United States is utterly unpredictable. And it's not so-called strategic uncertainty, as some have tried to claim, where you sort of say, well, we're gonna mess with our adversaries by kind of pretending to be unpredictable so that they'll kind of be a little bit scared and they'll do what we say because they don't want us to lash out at them. This is, non-strategic uncertainty. This is just uncertainty that is due to having at the head of the most powerful nation on earth a man who, whose foreign policy kind of depends on what he ate for breakfast and who he happened to chat with that day and his mood, which is very, very scary.
Yeah, no, there's no question about it. Trump's foreign policy is...
I could just jump in quickly, David. I was realizing that there is a metaphor hidden in plain sight on my very screen. And I hadn't even thought about this, but I'm actually visiting a friend and noticing that the wallpaper behind me is like the zigzag. So this is like an illustration of Trump foreign policy in action.
Yeah, no, it is. I was going to say that Trump foreign policy is Wilsonian, but as a reference to the character Pudd'nhead Wilson, because he is, clearly inconsistent. That is his one constant trait. Having said that, Max, I want to take issue a little bit with what Ed just said, and use it my minor disagreement to compare the foreign policy of China and the United States. People may be catering to both of them right now, but China is the force for consistent policy in the world right now. China is much more stable and predictable than the United States in terms of its foreign policy right now. And unlike Russia, for example, China tends to be a little bit more interested in, having a functioning international system, albeit one where it has much more influence than it has had. And I think, my take on the consequences of the Trumpian foreign policy we've just talked about, and that all of you agree on this core issue of chaos, is that so far China's been the big winner. I get this feeling that Xi Jinping wakes up every day and goes, it's a great day. We're better off today than we were yesterday because of Trump tariffs or Trump inconsistency in this part of the world, or Trump's faltering at home, or American fascism, or what, that China just seems stronger by comparison. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Completely. I mean, I think so far Trump's foreign policy is one gift after another to China. And it's undermining one of the key advantages that the United States has over China, which is that we have a lot of allies and they don't. And so that's why it's so harmful when Trump is doing things like unilaterally imposing 25% tariffs on two of our key allies in Asia, South Korea and Japan, because those are countries we need to keep on side. Those are key American partners in containing the rise of China, and yet he is just completely alienating them, especially at a time, and especially harmful at a time when South Korea has a new president who is actually more friendly to China than his predecessor and more interested in balancing South Korean policy between China and the United States. And Trump is giving those Asian leaders every reason to balance against the United States. And remember, I mean, China has entered into free trade accords with many of its neighbors, whereas Trump is tearing up one free trade accord after another, including the free trade agreement that we reached more than a decade ago with South Korea. He's also doing things like defunding the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, all these American information services that the tyrannical regimes like the one in Beijing or in Moscow, they hate those because those the VOA and its sister agencies, they undermine that totalitarian thought control that Beijing is counting on. And Trump is all of a sudden saying, here, we won't contest your narrative. In fact, we're going to dismantle all of our bureaucracy designed to counter dictators' disinformation. So we're just going to give you guys like free reign over the internet, over the information space. You can put out any lies you want, and we're not going to do anything to counter you. I mean, this is like one gift after another. And then the fact that Trump is also radically slashing U.S. aid, having destroyed the USAID, slashed U.S. foreign aid spending by over 80%. Again, this is creating huge openings for China in places like Africa, where they've been trying to increase their influence for years. The U.S. is used to be in the game. We no longer are. We're taking, we're basically unilaterally disarming when it comes to soft power, and therefore opening the door wide for China with their Bridge and Road Initiative and so many other things that they're doing to try to win over developing countries. This is, one gift after another. And at the end of the day, I think, to your point, David, I think you're spot on talking about the fact that the U.S. right now no longer looks like a benign superpower compared to China. Trump is rapidly squandering the advantage we used to have of people would think of China as this uniquely threatening power, whereas and would think of the United States as relatively benign and willing to work with allies and protect them, and not screw them out at every turn that we can for some momentary passing advantage. But Trump has forfeited all that. He looks like a very malign actor, and by comparison is making Xi Jinping seem almost less malign by comparison, certainly more predictable and less erratic.
Yeah, and I, correct me if I mischaracterized what you were saying, but I do think that it's possible to say that Trump's foreign policy is to make China great again. That he has really gone a great way to eliminate U.S. advantages, to make China look stable by comparison. And of course, China's not letting any grass grow under its feet on any of this stuff. When the U.S. won't let scientists in, they're saying, well, come here and be scientists here and we'll invest in it. And, they're pushing ahead with AI, and they're pushing ahead with all sorts of initiatives around the world to institutionalize the relationships. So, I mean, this really does seem like the beginning of a real era of ascendancy to me for China. And you may disagree. I'd just like to pick up on that.
Yeah, well, so I'm not entirely sure whether our agreement is minor or medium-sized. I mean, I think if you're saying that the US has become a malign, coercive diplomatic actor under Trump, but it's erratic and unpredictable, whereas under China, its coercive diplomacy is predictable, then I agree with you. If you're saying that China is perceived as less malign than the United States under Trump in parts of the world, of course, it depends which parts of the world we're talking about, then I might well agree with you. But if you talk to people from South Korea or from Japan or from Australia or from India or from Europe, most European capitals, they have no illusions about the kind of world that China wants, and they don't applaud that. But sometimes on some specific issues, such as on trade, it is very much the lesser of two evils right now. And there are ad hoc arrangements, some of them highly improbable, and a serious measure of Trump's complete incompetence and sort of law of foreseeable unintended consequences, that China is forging closer ties with South Korea and Japan, two countries that deeply fear China, on trade. And Trump has just sort of upped that ante by slapping 25% tariffs on them over and above the 25% tariffs on their autos. He could push Japan into recession. He could kill the Ishiba government. So that desperation is pushing them closer to China, but it's the wariest of lesser of two evils cooperation going on. The EU, again, is cooperating with China to a degree we didn't expect to see because of Trump's actions. But it sees Russia's war effort, China, as being integral to Russia's war effort. So there are no illusions there. I agree. I think China is the geopolitical beneficiary of this. But I guess I was trying to stress another point. Let's not put on rose-tinted spectacles when we look at China. It's a rational and more predictable actor, and therefore potentially much more potent.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not putting on rose-colored spectacles, partially because I'm from New Jersey and I don't think I've ever used the term spectacles, but partially because I see that China is a threat to a lot of its neighbors, or at least perceived as a threat to some of its neighbors. Having said that, I do think we sometimes overstate what China's goals are. I don't think China seeks global domination. I think China seeks the biggest piece of the pie possible for China. They're very self-interested, and therefore extremely predictable. Whereas what we've gotten from the United States is shooting itself in the foot day after day after day, weakening itself, weakening its allies, and strengthening its adversaries. And that I think, which goes back to what all of you have said, and back to Max's initial comment. This is an era of uncertainty. What's your take on this this U.S.-China relationship and how it may be benefiting China, Rosa?
No, I mean, I'll essentially say the same thing I've said and that Ed and Max have said. This is a huge opportunity for China. And it goes back to that issue of predictability, that predictability matters more in some ways than the degree to which you view a state as having policies that are inimical to your interests. Even if you view them as essentially hostile power, but they're predictable, you can function. You can sort of figure out how to function. You can figure out when to compromise, when to push back. That states tend to value predictability above almost anything else. And as Ed said, that it's not so much that China has suddenly become appealing to everyone. It's not so much that the Chinese model, such as it is, to the extent that we can say there is a Chinese model, suddenly looks great. It's more that you can count on China. You can figure out what China's interests are. You can figure out what China's interests aren't. You can rely on China to pursue its interests to the best of its ability. You can rely on China to not really care very much about things that don't affect its core interests. So you can find areas of cooperation as well as areas of contestation, whereas we're the most dangerous creature of all in the United States. And I think a big mistake that all of us made, myself included, early on, certainly by the beginning of Trump's first administration, was that we thought he was transactional. And transactional implies a degree of predictability. I mean, the Chinese are transactional in many ways. They will have allies of convenience and so forth, but they by and large behave in predictable ways and keep their agreements. Trump is not actually transactional. Yes, he has a tendency to frame things in transactional terms, but we shouldn't mistake a transactional rhetoric. What have you done for me lately? Well, I'm not going to do this unless they do that, for actually being transactional in his foreign policy, because his foreign policy is so erratic and unpredictable. He doesn't necessarily he likes to make deals, but he doesn't keep the deals he makes, and he's just erratic. So, I do think that, I don't think China is feeling super happy, right? Because China does not like an erratic United States either. Even to the extent that we're shooting ourselves in the foot and making them, relatively speaking, more attractive, it makes the world more unstable and dangerous for China as well. So I don't think the Chinese are sitting there cackling happily and saying, "Oh, hooray, this is fantastic." I think the Chinese are thinking, shit, we're in a kind of perilous moment where we both have some real opportunities which we should try to seize, but there are also real dangers that we didn't face just a couple of years ago.
No question, that's true. In the remaining time, I'd like to go to each one of you with perhaps a 2-minute question answer segment that looks at a subset of what is part of this foreign policy. Max, I've recently seen some comments from you on Ukraine policy. The president, as you note, was, shifted us to pro-Russia, then has been frustrated by Putin, somewhat miraculously discovering what all the world knew, that Putin was not a reliable actor, cutting off arms, saying he had nothing to do with that, restoring some arms flows, but only defensive arms and less than he had promised before. Net, do you feel Russia is a net beneficiary of Trump Ukraine policy?
I mean, so far, yes, because if you just think about what would have happened if Kamala Harris had been president right now, I think it's probable we would have had another major U.S. Weapons package for Ukraine, which is something we have not had in more than a year. And the last one, which was passed last spring, is rapidly dwindling, even though there's still some weapons in the pipeline, including the ones that Trump resumed shipping this week. So clearly, I think if you had President Harris in office, she would be coordinating much more closely with the Europeans and ratcheting up the pressure on Russia. And I mean, another example of where Trump is failing to hold Russia's feet to the fire is on the issue of sanctions. He has not imposed any new sanctions on Russia since coming to office, which means that the existing sanctions are eroding because, Russia and its foreign partners are constantly finding new ways around the sanctions. And you got to keep sanctioning new companies and targeting new deals if you want to prevent these sanctions from eroding. But Trump is not doing that. And so the sanctions are, in fact, eroding. Now, I think that there is, at least rhetorically, Trump is signaling an unexpected degree of frustration with Putin because he came into office with these ridiculous notions that, he could end the war in a day and Putin would be his buddy and Putin wants to end the war. I mean, I don't know where he got any of these ideas from, but now he is being somewhat disabused of those illusions. And he's understanding that, as he said in the cabinet meeting so eloquently, what Putin is saying is bullshit. Well, yes, it is. I'm glad you noticed what everybody else knew from the beginning. But now the question is, what is Trump going to do about it? And, certainly allowing a small pittance of U.S. aid to flow is a good start, but it's not enough. What he needs to do is push for a new weapons package through Congress. And the other thing he needs to do urgently is to release the frozen Russian funds in the West to Ukraine. And my understanding is that the amount of frozen Russian money in the United States is much higher than we realized, it could be as much as $50 billion. That is a ton of money. If Trump takes $50 billion in Russian money and gives it to Kiev, that is going to fund the Ukrainian war effort for, at least a year, probably more to come. And that will be a massive blow to Russia. And that will make Putin think like, gosh, maybe I can't wait out Zelensky. Maybe I actually need to compromise and make a deal, because right now there's nothing that Trump has done that leads Putin to negotiate in any way seriously. Instead, Putin is ramping up his offensive. And, Trump keeps claiming that Putin would have never invaded Russia if Trump had been president. But in fact, just since Trump has come back into office, Putin has radically ramped up his air attacks on Ukraine, targeting Ukrainian cities. And he hasn't shown any evidence that he's afraid of Trump. Trump needs to put a little fear into Putin. Otherwise, this war will continue to rage out of control.
I hate to be a pedant about this, although I don't really. I like to be a pedant.
You love it. You love it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. No, I do. Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014, and every moment of Trump's first term was waging war against Ukraine. And Trump always says he wouldn't have done it. He did it every moment of his first term in office. And it's a particular bugaboo of mine. And we've talked a little bit about the tariffs here. And, I find it strange considering how much we've talked about it and how much it's in the news and how much the markets have sort of said what they think about it. And how clear it is what experts think about it, that the tariff policy becomes more incoherent every day, that it is less and less likely. We have less and less idea of how this all is going to pan out. But that's just, for, people like me from New Jersey. You work for the Financial Times, and so you must know how it's all going to turn out. And that's what I'd like to know.
I think one thing's very clear is that not just every country, but every company that does any kind of sort of international operations is now incorporating geopolitical risk and political risk into its ordinary reporting. This used to be, something they'd invite somebody like one of us every, annual general meeting to talk about foreign policy, and just so that they keep their senior leadership abreast. Now this is something that's, scenario planning. Will it end up being 140% on China, 30% on China, 50%? I was like, the differences between these are huge. Access to critical minerals. Where is that going to come from? Will China retain a stranglehold? Will the global supply chain be hit by, Strait of Hormuz or Suez Canal, whatever it might be? This is now part and parcel of their daily perspective. And Trump has rocket boosted just the political noise and risk and uncertainty around doing business. And that's a cost on everybody. It's a tax on everybody. So I don't know specifically where the Trump kabuki deals will end up and how long they'll end up being stuck to. But what we're seeing sort of more deeply, to go back to that overused, tired tectonic analogy, is we're seeing the fracturing of the globalized economy. We're seeing a lot of sort of decouplings going on. I mean, not just the Europe decoupling from Russian energy that we've seen since 2022, or US decoupling with China over high-end semiconductors and AI processors, but also things we didn't anticipate. The EU-US defense sectors are beginning a big decoupling, which is very significant. Because although Europe's saying we're going to spend more on defense, they're not saying we're going to spend it on American weapons systems. They are looking to develop their own and buy elsewhere on the global market. That is really significant. There's sort of cross-dressing going on, if you like. I mean, it used to be that China's interest in Africa was in its critical minerals and other commodities. And that's still primarily China's interest in Africa. But our criticism was always they're really the blood diamond power in this great game, and we're the responsible actor in the West. Now they're kind of swapping roles there, because China is saying, well, we're going to have complete tariff-free access for all African goods to China, not just commodities, but anything you make, anything you manufacture, zero tariff access. Whereas the US under Trump is just after critical minerals. It just wants to get those critical minerals to balance against. These are really significant things happening that will be impervious to whatever levels of tariff levels Trump ends up agreeing on these supposed 90 deals. I don't believe they're going to happen. And I believe if there is one consistency to Trump, is that he sees these deals as grift opportunities. He doesn't want to end the global tariff war, because this is a tool of extraordinary personal enrichment, not just for him, but for people in his family and for people in the families of people who work for him. I mean, there's a whole grift machine. So I don't expect his trade war to end whilst he's president. But I do expect deglobalization to continue. People are hedging. They're now prioritizing resilience over efficiency, which is another way of saying deglobalizing. And that will cost us all.
Yeah. By the way, all these rare earth deals are complete bullshit. First of all, some of them are, like in Ukraine, they don't even know if the rare earths are there. But secondly, the amount of time it would take to identify them, get in there, invest the money in getting them out, and so it takes us decades into the. It's just nonsense.
But
Rosa,
money
what?
changes hands now, right? I mean, this is the thing.
Well,
Trump doesn't care about that.
yeah, well, no, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. Rosa, one of my criticisms of Biden foreign policy was that they failed to. They were very concerned about the risk of Russians, responding in a nuclear way in Ukraine and so forth. But they completely failed to do political risk analysis of what would happen in the U.S. if we had a major political shift, and we were unable to continue to support Ukraine. And so the last question here is: it sounds to me from all of this like the big X factor and the biggest political risk factor for the world is the U.S. and that within that, U.S. foreign policy is a part of it. But U.S. domestic policy is a big part of it. If we go completely authoritarian and so forth, that's a big risk. Do you agree? And maybe elaborate.
I was just at a conference and I was on a panel and I was asked, what do you see as for an international security perspective, what's the greatest threat to the United States today? And I said the United States is the greatest threat to the United States today, as well as to global stability. And part of that is our domestic policy. When other states see that we like to say authoritarian slide, but this is not a slide. We are tumbling precipitously towards authoritarianism and dramatically increasing the risk of political conflict. I don't think we're going to have some kind of civil war, but I do think that the risk of just sort of more generalized chaos and rising political violence is going up and up. And as the level of open graft and corruption, as we've been discussing, goes up and up, that too imposes costs on the global community, and it imposes costs on us. I mean, our domestic policy is absolutely risk. And I also agree with you very much, David, as you know, that I think we can fault the Biden administration for really not wanting to think about this. I mean, and on one level, it's not that useful to complain about the Biden administration right now. They're not in power. So, it's sort of backwards looking. And it's of a piece with the failure to really grapple with the fact that Biden himself no longer had the ability to continue to serve or to be the candidate for the party, but a sort of refusal to accept reality that also extended to we're not interested in trying to plan now to try to lock in as much as we can just in case Trump wins, because they just assumed that Trump was not going to win. And that's the old, hope is not a strategy, but it wasn't even hope. It was just a sort of complacency, I think, that prevented essential planning. And indeed, as you know, I would go back even further and say I fault both the Biden and the Obama administration before it for continuing and enjoying the use of some of the very unconstrained emergency presidential and executive branch powers that we now see Trump abusing in egregious ways because it was convenient for them, and responding to critics by saying, oh, no, don't worry, we have good policies in place within the executive branch to prevent mistake and abuse and so forth, which was, of course, completely missing the point. The point being that you are creating sets of precedents and expanding precedents that if some president comes in who is not so nice and doesn't feel like having internal policy checks to prevent abuse, that these are very, very dangerous. And both Obama and the Biden administration really ignored those because it was just inconvenient to have to deal with it.
Yeah, very good point. Very well made. I think people who listen to our podcast have heard us talk about these themes for a while, and I'm writing some stuff now that you'll probably end up hearing me say it more. But I do think that these common themes for the past 40, 50 years in U.S. history has been overestimating the strength of our enemies and underestimating our own fragility, the fragility of our systems. I think we will come back to that. There's a lot more here to discuss and unpack, but I do think periodically, given what our mission is here, it's important to say, well, what from a foreign policy and national security perspective, where are we and where should we be looking? Hopefully you found that this has been a useful discussion in that regard. And I know that to the degree to which you have, it's because we have these great guests with us this week and every week. So thank you, Rosa, and thank you, Ed, and thank you, Max, for joining us. We've got more like this every single day. And if you like it, go to the dsrnetwork.com, click on membership, and help support what we're doing in a small but important way. Roughly the price of a latte per month gets you to be a subscriber and helps us to keep this all going as we have now, what is it, Rosa, the past 50 or so years of podcasting? We're coming up on the half-century mark.
50 sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, 50 feels about right to me. Hopefully we'll have another 50 more. Until then, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.